Hello, my name is Funk McLovin. Homestuck is a webcomic from 2009 written by Andrew Hussey. It is the story of a group of teenagers who need to overcome an overwhelming evil and from the destruction of their world, create a new one. It is the story of coming of age that enshrines obscure Americana from the 90s and aughts and became a cult sensation on the web and in convention halls across the globe. Today, it is a multi-million-dollar property spearheaded by Viz Media. But it is a story with flaws that arose from being written over the course of 7.5 years, and an author who remains blind to many of the comic's core issues. But this isn't a podcast about critique. This is a project made to rewrite Homestuck. The revisions made in this podcast are not all-encompassing and represent the opinions of the hosts and the hosts only. It won't cover anything outside of the comic itself, such as the various tie-ins and spin-offs, including Friend Sim, Pester Quest, or the Paradox Space comic. If you're not familiar with Homestuck to begin with, you are very much welcome here. By the end of this series, we plan to have a revision of the entire Homestuck story from beginning to end, in the format of an audio fic. Homestuck, of course, belongs to Andrew Hussey and Viz Media, and is available for free on Homestuck.com. Without further ado, this is Rewriting Homestuck. My name is Funk McLovin, and I'm here with my two good friends, Janaya and Bucky. They can introduce themselves at their leisure, but for right now, I've done the Homestuck speedrun. I have done a lot of Homestuck videos, and right now I want to do a podcast project known as Rewriting Homestuck, in which I take some sort of structural look at Homestuck at large and try to rewrite it to have a little better themes, because if there's one thing about Homestuck, is it's fucking disorganized. So why don't you go first, Janaya? We'll go from left to right here.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Janaya. I am a writer within the Homestuck fandom. I'm currently the director and lead writer for Friend Sim 2. I'm the narrative director for New Game Plus, which is another fan game. And I just write a whole fucking lot all the time.
Hey, I'm Bucky. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the director of New Game Plus and a writer for that and Friend Sim 2. I had a podcast about class specking stuff that wasn't inside Homestuck, but I also have a YouTube channel where I do videos on character archetypes in Homestuck and how they relate to non-Homestuck characters. And I also write and draw a decent amount.
Yeah, you guys are... I chose you guys because you are the two people who I've seen have sort of the most critiques on Homestuck at large. And episode 1 will be devoted to sort of the premise-based and thematic stuff. So spoilers for Homestuck will be here. In further episodes, we will be discussing sort of act by act how we would change the plot structure. But for now, why don't we talk about I think the thing that we all have in common for critique, which is the age of the characters. Does anyone have anything to say about that specifically?
I'm sure Janaya does.
Yeah, I have a few things to say on that. So... This is a really common criticism I've had of Homestuck, which is that, and I'm for edification of those who don't know me very well, I'm the mother to a teenager and a near teenager, so I have children that are like the age of the Homestuck kids, and the way that they're written in Homestuck, they are not written meaningfully as 13-year-olds, like in any way. It doesn't add anything meaningful to the plot. And, like, it introduces some kind of weird stuff into the dynamic that, like, if you just made them young adults, like, a whole bunch of issues would just disappear.
Yes. Well, what about you, Bucky? Do you have anything to add, or?
I read Homestuck for the first time when I was like slightly older than / the same age as the protagonists, and like you think that you're this smart and cool or whatever when you're that young, but it's rereading it again as an adult, it definitely it does strike me as like a work that both elevates kids in a way that would be fun if it was like aimed at kids, but I really don't think that Homestuck was ever intended to be consumed by young children.
Yeah, and this is backed up by the fact that a lot of the game material is rated M, and the content of Homestuck obviously is mature for mature audiences. There's nothing explicit visually, but there is a lot of there's a lot of fuck words, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. And there's not the requisite one allowed in a PG-13.
Precisely.
It's blown out of the water very quickly.
Now, myself, I don't have any kids, and I've never actually been a child myself. I've seen the people say like, this is just how kids on the internet talk, and I think that is true to a point. Because I've seen a lot of people defend the sort of ages of the kids in this way, that this is how it was on the internet as a kid. And for some people, that might be true. However, I think it's more representative of, an adult's experience on the internet. And kids of that age don't necessarily have to be the protagonists. I think you can still have a coming-of-age story, and I think that Spurb is still a coming-of-age story without having the kids being specifically 13.
Yeah, I actually, that's something that I've talked about before, is that I think that as a coming-of-age story, it actually works better if they are young adults, because, like, the kind of coming-of-age story that it tells isn't really one about, like, first learning that you have, like, independent agency, which is kind of what's happening at like 12 or 13, but instead, having to kind of go out into the world and make your own way and like separate yourself from your authority figures and from like, define the world's expectations for you. And like, that's all stuff that's more endemic for like a young adult. Like maybe if they were like 16, 17, like if the beta kids started at like 16 or 17, I think it could work as well. But like, it's not a story about 13-year-old coming of age. And I mean, it was written by a person who is a few years older than me. So like, I don't think it was ever written as a 13-year-old coming of age story. I think it was just like, they should be like teenagers because like, I don't know, just, for some reason.
I think it would also solve a sort of like, well, okay, let me rephrase. I don't think it would necessarily solve this problem, but I think it would make it less horrible, which is that there's a lot of like sexual over and undertones that are both like in between the teenage protagonists and between some of their shitty guardians, and I'm thinking about like Bro specifically and some of the shit with Gamzee specifically.
Laughs nervously.
It wouldn't be better if they were adults, but it would be less overtly creepy. Yeah. Because those are things that happen, but like there is a lot of like tonal variancy that Homestuck takes on, and and the variancy is it varies widely very quickly. And I think that like it's not that these things aren't things that happen in real life, but I think if we're gonna pick themes, because as JoJo mentions, it's disorganized, we could maybe remove some of the explicit on-screen child abuse. Yeah, I think is a thing that we could do.
Honestly, I do have a couple things about Bro and Mom specifically that we can either get into today or like in the early acts. But I totally agree on a sort of structural basis. Like, this is a story about, like Janaya said, kids not necessarily realizing they have... This is not a coming-of-age story like Steven Universe or Harry Potter, where these kids still have sort of authority figures and they're making their way in the world. This is a coming-of-age story that I think would suit... I had an idea. This was my idea, and I'll run it past you guys. We'll sort of figure out what we think of it. But my idea was they're all 18. Since their birthdays are very similar times, they're all turning 18 at a similar time. It takes place on John's birthday, his 18th birthday instead of his 13th. And they are about to all go to college at the same school. And they're excited to meet each other for the first time. And to sort of celebrate that, they're going to play this game called Spurb. And they think it's just going to be, a fun game where they can play online and get to know each other more. But obviously, as we know, it turns into Homestuck. And so the first act and onwards would be about these kids coming to terms with, they're not going to college. Instead, they're going to be the gods of the new universe, et cetera, et cetera. What do you guys think of that?
Yeah.
I like that for a couple of reasons, and one is like that's completely plausible given the way that like a bunch of our I don't know. I was born in the same year as John Egg-Bert was, so like it's completely
what year was that?
plausible
1980, 95?
6.
96?
It's 95 for all of the other kids
Yeah.
except
Okay.
for Jane and John.
Right.
I'm the same age as them, even though I started reading when I was 15, so that's why there's like a bit of a discrepancy. But like the characters, that's what I did when I went to college. Is I did meet up with some people that I met with and I knew online. It seems completely plausible to me that you could still have the characters literally be the same age and just not start it in 2009 because we're not in 2009 anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Also, there's this ongoing theme of like loss of guardian figures in Homestuck that happens over and over again. That like, again, it's not that children don't sometimes lose their guardian figures at 13, but like if we are going to pin this as a coming of age story, you do that when you go to college. When if in the Homestuck's also very grounded in an American zeitgeist, like it. So the current American heterosexual life path is you go to college at age 18. So it would make sense that like you'd be struggling with these ideas and then the upset of these ideas.
Yeah. And you could have the same the other thing I wanted to ask was and you hit on this, was should it be still set in 2009 as like I don't want to call it a period piece because that makes me feel old, but for lack of a better term, a period piece in 2009, or should it be updated for a modern sort of zeitgeist?
Jojo, technically we have 2 decades removed from 2009, considering that was in the aughts and we're currently in the 2020s.
I don't know that it matters all that much. Like, I think that having it set like whenever you wrote it is fine. Having it set as a more like timeless piece is fine. Having it set at some undefined point in the past is fine. Like, obviously Homestuck makes cultural references which are like obviously heavily centric to Andrew Hussey's specific like upbringing and life and everything that mattered to them in that period, which like again is also fine. But like I don't know that it especially matters. Like you could set it in a timeless period. You just have to make the references more generic or remove them or just accept they feel anachronistic. Like I don't know, that strikes me as being a detail that you could play around with and it could kind of go either way. But like I agree with Bucky as far as like the college coming of age storyline and like it being like that's the time when you move away from your family and you're expected to sort of like be an adult, except that, you know, as we all know, having lived through it, except Jojo, who is ageless, you know, that it's not that simple. Like you don't just like snap your fingers and become an adult at 18. You're still figuring shit out. And yet you're socially expected to have your shit figured out, which I think there's a lot of parallels between that experience and the experience of going into Suburb. Like they're all expected to just kind of like know what the fuck they're doing in this game, and none of them do. And I think that actually making that parallel intentionally would be a way of dealing out the message of Homestuck in a stronger, more coherent way, whereas it feels a little bit disjointed the way that it's currently written.
I like that. So I would say, for the sake of, pinning down a specific time, I think keeping it in 2009, just having them sort of aged up,
Yeah, that's
would
fine.
be a way to
Yeah.
go, because then you could retain a lot of those sort of something awful-esque sort of verbosity.
God, that kicks me right back into the early days of my time on the internet.
Because that's I think that's what it's emulating, is like the 4chan,
Oh, yeah.
something awful, Kiwi
It
Farms,
is.
whatever, forum zeitgeist.
Yeah,
milieu.
having been on the Something Awful forums in like 2001, absolutely.
Definitely. And then you can still have that, and then they could have grown up sort of in the late 90s aughts. I think that still preserves a lot of the, John's love for shitty films of that time, like Con Air.
Yeah.
And, the second thing after the ages that I wanted to talk about was sort of where everyone is. And I think that, like, geographically speaking, because we know, just to review, John lives in Washington, Rose lives in upstate New York, Dave lives in Texas, and Jade lives in the Pacific Islands. And
Fictional ocean in the Pacific Island,
Yes.
yeah.
right. And I wanted to talk about not necessarily sort of the setting, not necessarily the setting of Spurb, but the setting of the world as it is before it is destroyed in the beta timeline, because that's sort of where everything starts from. And then from that, we can talk about... and also this 18-year-old stuff also goes for the alpha kids when they eventually get into
Right.
the game, obviously.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
someone mentioned Americana, and I was wondering sort of what about their... I think it should still take place in America, because it is an American story, Americana, whatever. I think that's fine. But what changes having them 18 in these sort of areas?
Well, speaking of the setting, out of all of the beta kids, the one that feels the most accurate in terms of being grounded in her setting is Rose, probably because we know the author grew up near upstate New York and could extrapolate upstate New York from Massachusetts pretty accurately.
That makes sense.
But like Momo's pointed out that John Egg-Bert does not feel like a character who knows anything about Washington, despite having lived their entire life there. And the less that's said about the way Andrew Hussey characterizes Dave, the better. And
Yeah.
and Jade is a fucking anomaly in terms of setting for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
Setting. I think it's important to establish like where they are from and what that colors about them, because as it stands right now, Earth is just sort of thrown away in Homestuck. And I don't think there's enough weight given to the fact that like the world is literally ending. And I think that establishing a concrete setting for each of these characters to come from, like Dave from Texas, John from Washington, et cetera, would help in that sort of disconnect.
Yeah, I think that, like, one thing that's always kind of, like, bothered me about Homestuck's character reactions is that, like, none of them seem to have a particularly strong reaction to the fact that their entire planet was literally destroyed with all of the people on it being killed. And it's like, none of them feel... How do I put this? None of them feel like people from a place that has people. They all feel like they're singular isolated characters that have one person that they know who's their guardian, and then any friends they have, and then like it feels so weirdly isolated in a way that I don't like. It doesn't necessarily hurt this story, but it sure doesn't help it either. And it would be cool to have them actually have reaction to that and have like some sense of a life and experience that then could be built off of, both in terms of like how they react within Suburb to stuff, and then also like when we start getting into the introduction of the trolls and the introduction of the alpha kids, how they react to the other characters and how they play off of them. Because like as it stands, they all feel extremely isolated as characters, and I'm not sure that doesn't necessarily work too well. And I think it also plays into some of the issues that when we start talking about like story structure that come into like the dialogue and how the dialogue is presented.
You just gave me an idea
Mm-hmm.
out of that they don't know anyone. We could have like secondary people who they talk to. Like, for instance, other friends on, they could have, instead of just John talking to Dave and, one-on-one conversations, they could have, like, pester logs that involve others. The only time you see something like that would be when John gets on his dad's, PDA, and sees other people talking in the forum that dad is. So if you had, like, let's say you had, going off the Something Awful equivalents, you had some like forum that was equivalent to Something Awful that people could sort of, you could have some foreshadowing a la, the Cornetto trilogy, where it's like people talking about meteors striking more and more, and you can read these forum posts and stuff like that. But like you said, something that grounds, so, like, characters that you care about at least a little bit who die off because of the apocalypse, I think would increase that disconnect that is there. And then having a more, stable connection to the place they're from. That would be good. Moving on from, I think, the beta kids, is how would these changes in terms of setting and age affect the trolls?
Okay.
Because they're the other side of the coin.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the same issues that color the experience of the beta kids, like, have the same issues for the trolls, but even more so. So, like, Alternia is super fucked up, and like there's some really like unpleasant stuff that Alternia has, and like I don't think that shying away from that is a good approach. But like the fact that, again, they're all like teenagers, they're supposed to be the same age, that like leads to some very weird shit about, like, they're obviously portrayed as, like, the trolls are even more portrayed like they're adults than the kids are. Like, they are portrayed as like independent adults who have all of these like very adult relationships with each other.
There are no adults on Alternia. They are the adults.
Well, that's
basically
the thing. Like, that shit is really fucking weird. And like, I think that's sort of like kind of the headcanon that we ended up using for FriendSim 2, and this is one I've seen in other fan works, which is why we used it, where they go off-world at like 10 sweeps. So there's this period of like, they are adults, like legally adults, they're mature emotionally and physically, but they haven't like been forced off world yet, so they've got this kind of weird in between like gray area where they have to sort of like do adult stuff, but also they know they're going to go off world, so it's like it's a very strange, like, it kind of mimics that, or kind of mirrors that sort of college experience of having this in between period in your life where you're kind of like, you have to be responsible for stuff in a new way, but also like, it's going to end in a few years. In fact, like, if you were to do that, you'd have an almost direct parallel to that like period of college, and you could have the trolls be effectively the equivalent of human adults, so that all of the sex stuff that Alternia talks about literally all of the time doesn't feel as weird, and stuff like Vriska and Mina doesn't feel as weird, and all of that, like, that gets into weird age shit. It's like, just make them 18 years old, or the whatever equivalent of like 9 sweeps, and then like they're basically in that one sweep period before they're forced off world. And I think that is a much more like coherent story to have those two mirroring elements, and it eliminates a lot of the weird shit, and it means you can lean into some of the horror of Alternia without people being like, wait a minute, it's kind of fucked up that you're writing it about a bunch of teenagers fucking.
Back on track. We, like Janaya said, making the trolls aged up would also be for the best, I think. And it would parallel that sort of college struggle where the kids are like, oh, I can't wait to go to college and go into school. Maybe there's some subplot about Dave. You know, he can't afford college or some bullshit like that, and he's like super hyped that the world is dying because he hates life or something. We can get into that.
Which would be interesting because in the original comic, we know that Bro is like a millionaire, but like chooses to not fucking take care of himself or his kid.
Yeah.
Sword fridge.
Which is you could still run with that and say like, there's no way Dave is going to get to go to college on a scholarship because his brother makes too much money, and for some reason is impeccable with his taxes, so he doesn't get investigated. So, like, the colleges are like, well, your father makes $2.4 million a year, and unfortunately, we just can't give you any merit-based scholarships for this. And Dave's like, I literally eat once a day. Can you please give me a scholarship? There are knives and swords in our refrigerator.
Please help.
That could be interesting to do.
Yeah, definitely. And for the trolls, I think that there's already some intentionality in the trolls' upbringings. Like Karkat wants very much to be a Thresh Executioner, and people have aspirations beyond their groups. So a lot of that's already baked into the trolls. I think that involving other characters who don't make it into Spurb to them would be also good. There are already some who exist, like in Friendsim and such. So, you know, involving, you know, posts from like Branya or something.
Well, but in the canon, Friendsim is supposed to take place like hundreds of years before. Like those are trolls that lived on the planet like well before any of the others. Now, if you're rewriting it,
I thought it was only a couple of years, but I don't.
Oh no, they're like they talk about like Malek's symbol not having existed for like some long period of time.
It's also implied to be a couple of hundred years because like heiresses being born are rare, and Trizza was born, died somehow, and then either Pfeffery came along after that, or there were a couple of heiresses between that and Pfeffery. But like, it's gonna at least be the natural lifespan of a fuchsia, probably before another one is born. That's like spitballing, but I also think the lifespan thing needs to be directly addressed as like, this was something I was going to suggest is the trolls, instead of being related to college, would be more related to like ascending into the military because they are in a militaristic society. And you can do like, I would like to drill a little bit more into the world building and specifically to look at the way like a military industrial economy is screwing with this society. And on top of that, like I want explicit confirmation that the trolls' differing lifespans are because of the conditions that they live in and are subjected
that's huge.
to.
That is a huge thing. I totally 100% agree. Where right now, I talked about this in the troll biology video too, where right now it's just, you know, trolls live different lifespans. And I think that is sort of existentially upsetting. And I think that having every troll have a similar lifespan, with the exception of maybe, you know, the fuchsias or something, having the same lifespan, but they exist in different numbers and die off more quickly because of their blood caste, I think that is like much more intentional.
Yeah.
And I think that's the main theme, is there's a lot of stuff in Homestuck that I don't think is intentional. And even if we keep some of these details, we could keep them with more intentionality. Like someone was talking about the bro thing. I think that a lot of it just got tossed in this sort of spaghetti pot by Andrew Hussey without any thought of the implications. And having that intentionality, I think, is important. But what were you going to say, John?
I was going to say that, so just to clear something up, I was saying, I was talking about the experience of the trolls kind of mirroring this sort of like, oh, we're going to college. And I mean that in the literal sense, where it's like, this is kind of the inverse, where instead of like, oh boy, we get to go away to college and be independent, it's more like, oh shit, we've got like 2 years and we have to go into the fucking army. Like, this is something that I've dealt with a lot in my writing because I really like digging into the like existential horror that's implicit in some of Alternia's like social structures, and like we can talk about it more when we talk about like hive bent specifically, but like I agree with Bucky. I think in general this should be like this is such rich ground for like one, it provides the characters with like kind of an established motivation. It also gives them more of a push to want to do scrub, as opposed to it being more of a like, oh shit, this is a thing we're doing now, but more of a thing where they want to do it, or at least some of them do. I think it says a lot about Alternia that I think is really important as you go along in the story, and like it provides a reflection for the main cast. So you have this like, you already have such like, you have such a mirroring plot going on already, but like it always feels like it could be a lot more structured and intentional, and I feel like that gives you the framework for that, which I think is good.
Also making them like adults or near adults really makes a bunch of the themes that they have feel like you can expand on them more anyways, because like I feel like Karkat at 18 is gonna have a much more interesting struggle with like wanting to join the military because it's everything he's ever known, but like knowing that he if he ever got caught or exposed, he would be instantly executed. Maybe you understand what that means a bit better at 18 than you do at 13.
I think it also gives you gives you a little more time for the Trills to like know each other and have their relationships be established, and then like have them kind of like have filled out through like whatever the troll equivalent of like your teenage years is, and however that works, until you're at this point where they all have an established dynamic, because like both sets of trolls have an established dynamic that we're kind of dropped into the middle of. We just get a little bit more backstory on the beta trolls and the alpha trolls, and I think that could be like, again, the aging them up doesn't really lose anything, but you do gain like character experience, basically.
You're right. It doesn't lose anything. A lot of people who talk about like, well, their ages are necessary because that's how kids talk. I don't think that you can make that same argument if they were 18.
Yeah.
I don't really think that. I mean, some 13-year-olds, I'm sure, used to talk in 2009 like that. Fine. But there are also 18-year-olds who talk like that, and it could add a lot to the stuff. Also, it's our rewrite, so they can shut up.
Yeah, and the other thing is, like, I think that, because I've heard that argument too, and it's like, okay, cool, but, like, it's more than just how they talk. It's how they act and what their life experiences are, and then how that plays into the narrative as a whole. And, like, I don't think that Homestuck does the best job of actually establishing that. And so they just kind of feel like default adults that don't have a really defined like life before Homestuck starts, and I think that you could gain a lot by giving them more of that depth and backstory, and by having them have a little bit more maturity as far as being able to reflect on this stuff intentionally within the narrative, because they already basically act like adults, so why not just like own it and then lean into that?
Makes sense. You guys also gave me an idea for a scene between John and Karkat. It would be pretty funny, where John is, maybe they're meeting for the first time in person, and John's like, "Man, I can't believe you guys are shipped off to like a horrible military industrial complex when you turn of age." And Karkat is like, "Yeah, and I can't believe you guys get shipped off to a meaningless job market." And they're like reflecting on how, how horrible each other's planets were or something. And
also on Earth, you definitely still can get shipped off to fuel the military-industrial complex. That is still a thing you can do. It's just that probably, hey, you know what? Maybe Jade is trying to get like an Air Force scholarship or something. Like you could.
Funny.
I don't know. That could be dicey depending on how it was handled. But like, that is something else that like the U.S. colonized in a lot of places, but particularly islands in the Pacific Ocean. So like if you're gonna I don't know, I'd like to see a story about how Jade deals with that, written by somebody with experience, because
I think that'd be very, very good.
Not Andrew Hussey though.
That's probably a theme we'll come back to, is that like I said, there's not a lot of intentionality with a lot of these things that got tossed in the Homestuck spaghetti pot, and that is mainly Andrew Hussey just kind of tossing in details. Is there anything you guys wanted to bring up about changes that you would make?
Actually, what you just mentioned about, or what we just kind of collectively talked about, as far as like having different subjects that maybe like certain people aren't necessarily like the best people to write about. One of the core changes that I would make, especially given the breadth and depth of the work, is not having one writer. I would start out with having multiple writers and like playing off of the strength of everyone's like differing experiences and working together to create a collaborative work rather than having it be, you know, one person that's the person who creates everything with like input from other people, like kind of input from other people. And like, I know there's like, I don't know all the details about how everything was written in Homestuck. I know that some parts had like feedback from other people, or like, and certainly when you get into the epilogues in Homestuck 2, you get like other people involved. But like, I think from the very beginning, structuring the work as a collaborative piece would be significantly stronger, and it would mean you could bring in people that like have those experiences. Like, oh, you want to have somebody who's like from a certain background talk about a thing, like actually have a writer with that background. This comes back to the old debate about like including like more marginalized people in writers' rooms as opposed to just like hiring them as artists, because like it gives those marginalized groups actual say in the structure of the story, rather than having being a bunch of cishet white dudes that write a story and just like throw in representation to look better, but like none of them have any meaningful experience with it.
So like a communal sort of writing style. For shorthand, we can call that communism.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Also, we're functionally proposing to like write a Western isekai. So like
Lol.
we're like specifically an American isekai. So like having a writer's room seems reasonable.
Okay.
Oh
first of all,
God.
shut the
Blew
fuck
it wide
up.
open. Oh no.
This has nothing to do with having My Hero Academia theme songs.
No, you're
right now.
You're right.
Oh,
I mean
no.
that is basically what we're talking about, and like I think with a work of
Can't
this,
escape the isekai.
a work that's this complicated, like you're talking about, like, okay, I have a lot of criticisms for Andrew Hussey and like the way that they chose to do things and still do things, but like one thing that I will not take away from it is that they are like fantastically productive, and they created something massive with like very limited outside help for a lot of the core like writing, and like that is impressive, but in this case I don't think it's good. Like I think that it would have been a stronger work thematically if you'd had multiple people working on it collaboratively. So like very amazing that you could crank this out, but like I actually think it would have been much stronger if you hadn't done that.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. And that's, and I'll call this spaghetti pot theory, where Andrew Hussey, because he had to write it in sort of this short time, there's a lot of things that he didn't think through. And that is not, that's not just a sort of qualitative critique. That is also a, you know, this could have been better if you had not done this critique. And I think that it would have improved if, I don't think anything would have changed meaningfully if he had more people, or I think that things would have changed meaningfully, rather, if he had more people, like you said, who had a different experience than, you know, some white guy.
Yeah.
No offense to Andrew Hussey. Lol.
And like, what the fuck do we do about June?
Oh, yeah. Thank you for reminding me. I have my own thoughts. Because,
going to college and discovering that you're trans seems like a pretty slam dunk.
If we can jump slightly ahead of ourselves, that's actually something I've given a lot of thought to, because, like, I have a story where June figures out that she's June during that 3-year period on the ship, where you have this like long period of just kind of nothing fucking happening, and like using that as a way to build character would have been really cool. We can talk about that more when we get into like that period of time, in the story, but like generally speaking, I like June as a concept, and like I feel like a lot of people in the fandom do, and I think it's a story that's pretty like meaningful and powerful to tell.
Yeah.
But I think that you can use the internal framework of your story structure to facilitate that, because you have a built-in sort of like downbeat in the story, which is a perfect time to establish character growth.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I think going back to like the original idea of June and saying like having the like almost not self-insert, but like easily like put on like a coat, sort of like vaguish main character that like deals with some depression and stuff, but like is just overall just like a dude becoming a trans woman is like still a pretty cool idea. Like having the dude protag not be a dude at all seems pretty good. I would like to get back to that in some way.
I have 4 words. Make her an egg.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing.
Make her an egg.
I think that it works really well as because like I found John to be kind of an uninteresting character for most of the story, and then like, so I for disclosure to the audience,
I think that's fine. If you want to have a boring protagonist, that is fine. But make her an egg.
So I was like, I'm an archival reader 100%. So like certain things hit differently for me than like update readers. Like the retcon actually, I think the retcon as a concept is kind of neat actually, and we can talk about that when we do that episode. But like, I think that having John, the kind of like bland, boring protagonist that then goes through this process of like self-discovery and self-actualization and becomes a more powerful, more interesting character within the narrative is like it's a really cool story that I think resonates with a lot of trans people. Like that was a story that I mean, that's not the story we actually got in canon, but like that was something that I identified very strongly with enough to write it myself, where it's like all of this like listless depression and everything is like, oh shit, there's like additional reasoning for that, and having that be something that's actually addressed in the story, because you've got that period in the story already. You might as well take advantage of it, basically, instead of just playing Ghostbusters a whole bunch.
Yeah, and on top of that, like, if you intend to have it there from the beginning, you can lay the foreshadowing down much more easily than if you, like... intentionality is good for writing stories, actually.
Yes.
Yeah. Like, I have heard the argument that, the trans femme coding of the character was there from the very beginning of the work, and I absolutely do not agree that was in there in any way on purpose. Like, I think that is a very common thing to do, where you take your experience and you overlay it on a character. I've done the same thing. I can do that for John, but I don't think that the narrative was set up with that in any way, but I think it could have been, and I think it would be very effective if it was, because when you're writing with intentionality, you can be deliberate about the stuff that you drop and the stuff that you don't drop. And then when it comes time to actually fulfill that plot line, it's like, aha, you remember this stuff? I told you it was going to be important. Rather than it just being like this rush to try to like cobble stuff together that wasn't supposed to be there in the first place.
Yeah. Hell yeah. I think that it would be funny if early on we could sort of foreshadow a couple things with June, like maybe a conversation with Dave, like, "Hey, Dave, every guy dreams about wanting to be a girl. It's just a normal guy stuff." Or one of the ideas I had was,
or with Rose, that Rose would eat that shit
absolutely.
up like candy.
Yeah, Rose would be like, oh my god, you gave me like brain blast. Rose would be like, so John, do you want to talk about sort of your gender feelings? And John would be like, I don't have any gender feelings. Shut up.
And she's like, well, I have this, so I saved this log from 2 months ago. This particular segment stuck out to me. I also saved this.
I just had another brain blast.
Yes.
What if we had so the police just ran their headlights because I had such a great idea, and they want to silence me. So before the police come, I'll just share with you. So, okay, retcon June. Retcon June, as a joke, goes back in time and talks to past June about, hey, you're trans. Past June interprets this as like a dream that they had where no, hear me out. And so through the entire like first couple acts, we hear June talk about this dream about their future self coming back, and it was a girl. And that becomes true later. That would be fucking hilarious.
I fucking love that.
My future self was a girl. What that? And Rose is like trying to. None of them think this is literal. Yeah. I think I saw my future self, but it was a girl, and Rose is like, interesting, writes notes.
I'm not saying that I am not a homosexual conversation should be in the new version, because, like, there's a lot to unpack there. But one of the fan comics I think is just fucking delightful is the one with, it has June and Dave as their god tiers, like, talking to each other, and they're talking, and, like, June is like, I'm not a heterosexual. I like women, stupid. Whoa. And then the punchline is like, so you're saying that you, June Egg-Bert, are a homosexual? And it's like, it was a funny little like subversion of that little moment in the comic. Funny. But yeah,
I thought you were going to talk about the one that was like, John, this has now. I'm going to tell you something, but this has nothing to do with our conversation vis-a-vis Naruto. the like, you don't have to be gay to see that Sasuke and Naruto should be.
Oh my god! I think that I think that another thing in the same vein of the trans thing is, and this exists somewhat in the text, the sort of compet bisexual Dave, where he's like, I like women and girls. That's it. And then every time he... And that's true, because he is bisexual. But then having him be like, oh, man, it's so weird and wild that, you know, sometimes men can be as attractive as girls sometimes. Just saying. So just egg shit like that. Like things where it's like, all right, you clearly... Because one of the things that Homestuck is divorced from is that environment of repression of LGBT stuff, and you can explore really in a huge way. If the world is gone, that no longer exists, and that might be good for some homosexuals out there.
Yeah, and that's why I'm
not advocating for blowing up the world, though. So.
No, I think that both with the humans and the trolls, there's a lot of like stuff for like LGBTQ stuff that and gender and sexuality that doesn't really get explored to its full effect, and like in some cases gets like gets twisted around. It gets twisted around in kind of a toxic way, and then like stuff like troll sexuality and gender is like a whole mess that I don't fucking know. We can probably talk about that when we get into Hivebent, but like I think that having a clearer idea of like how this stuff works and how it works, how much you're going to talk about it, and then like what that means could be really, really good. And you get stuff like, you know, Kanaya and Rose and their sexuality, and like,
oh yeah,
you know, how Kanaya's lesbianism is handled is weird in text. Like I feel like there's a lot of stuff that could be improved upon.
I think that Rose should be a lesbian like 100% from the beginning, and just because she doesn't have that quest. She is just like, I see a woman, because when she meets Kanaya, she's basically just like, I like her.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that making her like, you know, having early on, let's see here. I'm just gonna write some notes. Rose lesbionics. There we go. So we've talked a lot about what we'd change, and I think we got some good stuff. I wrote all this down so we can sort of apply it to the next act. So before we get into what we would keep the same, are there any like nuggets of the broad story or themes or whatever that that you guys would specifically change? I have one final one that might be a little controversial, but you guys can.
That we would
first.
Specifically what?
Change. Before we get into the things that we would keep the same.
This is like straddling both, but like I would like there to be less upfront computer science but more consistent computer science bits. Because like The alchemy stuff is fun, and like it's like I got caught up with Karkat Goes to a Convention last night. I know both Cole Kick Attack and Boogs of Suburb Tool Assisted Speedrun and and a bunch of other MSPFA people really like screwing around with alchemy and like what else you can do with alchemy based on like discrete mathematics, which is really what he's riffing on in the beginning. It's yes, it's coding, but you're more talking about like the application of discrete mathematics to coding and like like not graph theory, but like just like the like the different data structures and the different and like the stuff that goes into the alchemy is interesting to play around with because like I don't know, Kick Attack stops every so often to go, hey, do you want to watch us screw around to combine a bunch of shit in weird ways? And every single time I do want to do that. And I would like more of that. But I think making it less... We spend so fucking long, it feels like, on this is an array, this is a queue, this is a stack. And then we get to Jade and she's just like, fuck you, it's board games. Yes. I'm tired of this.
I like that.
And
I agree.
I think if you don't...
that comp size stuff is part of the Huss spaghetti pot, which we will... that we can use that. But continue.
I literally when I took data structures, I could have opened up my textbook and held it up next to Homestuck and gone, wow, this is helping me study. I didn't reread that bit at the time. It could have. And I think... I don't know.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
It's interesting, but it's oddly jarring for something that barely comes up ever again. At least make it consistent.
I think this is kind of like probably a thing we'll talk about more as we go through the act by act. But like as a general whole, I would agree with Bucky in terms of like I personally found the alchemy stuff and the Sylladex bullshit to be by far the least interesting part of Homestuck, and like. I think that, like, it's fun, but, like, balancing that with, like, balancing character stuff, random game stuff, and then, like, world-building stuff in a way that makes it feel a little more complete would be nice. Like, I don't want the... I don't want it to...
is huge.
I don't want to front load all the game stuff and then, like, oh shit, we've got characters. Let's do all of the character drama in Act 6. Like, it's just going to be nothing but character drama. Yeah. Like, I would like to have...
Big mood.
I would like to have a balance where you have character stuff throughout, you have world building throughout in a natural way, and then like the game stuff continues to matter even into Act 6 and the final stuff. Like I'm thinking of like the way that Act 8 deals with having like Act 8 being, for those who don't know, a fan venture written by Momo primarily, which takes place after the end of Homestuck. And like one of the things I like about that is it does have a lot of the game construct stuff, but in a way that feels integrated with the characters. Like they have to do certain things to accomplish their goals all the way up to the end, but also the character stuff is happening over the top of that. So like you never lose sight of either of those things. And I think as a general whole, that's something that needs to just be like sort of shifted around so that it doesn't feel like it's all game stuff and then all character stuff.
I was gonna say I keep thinking of it in terms of like role-playing games, but like you need to like go and get like an equipment upgrade and like go screw around with your inventory or whatever every so often, and that's kind of what the Sylladex segments are in a sense, or could be, where like you've done a bunch of questing on your plan or whatever, you have a fuckload of loot, you come back and you're like, I'm gonna make the best fucking hammer anybody has ever fucking made. Mm-hmm. I said that last time, but now I have better loot. And like that's a video game thing, or at least it's like a very open world grindy video game thing, as you have like there's already grist and resources and stuff, and this is actually pulling on video game threads that like weren't as... No, RuneScape was a fucking thing. What the fuck am I talking about? This totally ties in with Homestuck because it's Momorpug. But you can still have mechanics like that and play on that a bit more, I think, to make it feel a little bit more like they're still in a video game and less like they are incidentally doing video game things on the side.
I think if we're gonna and also if we're going to go all the way up through I don't know if you're planning to talk about the epilogues in this, or if you're just going to talk about like a generic epilogue.
I had written down. So broadly speaking, this project will not cover the post canon. We might have like a bonus 7th episode for the post canon. That might be fun. But I wrote down epilogues and HS2 non-canon.
Okay. Yeah, that's
so
fine.
This is rewriting cool. Homestuck as a unit.
As a unit,
this is
right.
Just rewriting Homestuck.
I will say that. So I think that also would provide a more stark contrast between the world of Homestuck and the world of whatever you do post canon. And I think that if you're going to play around with the concepts of like going back into the game or multiple realities or alternate timelines when you get past Homestuck, the fact that you've continued to establish the game structure as being a thing within Homestuck that then presumably aren't a thing outside of Homestuck gives you more of that contrast and more to work with as far as like doing some interesting things. That's probably getting like way the fuck ahead of ourselves. But yeah, I think that it's something that definitely needs to be balanced.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are a lot of things, and this will segue into the next bit, that we can keep the same. For instance, the basic timeline of events, broadly speaking, I think is fine. A lot of the stuff, like the more well thought out things, like the basic structure of Homestuck, I think is fine. You know, Acts 1 through 6, fine. We can keep the main story beats on for those, and we'll talk more about that when we get into the actual acts and parts. So the timeline, broadly speaking, can be the same. How time travel works, I think, would be cool to keep the same. You know, alpha timelines, beta timelines, the dream bubbles, etc., how those get set up. I think we can explore those in more depth, certainly, but they can work the same. And then the class specs as well, we can keep the same, like everyone's role in the story. We might change, like, you know, someone's specific class spec or how those work, but I think that keeping those the same, because those are they are the one lore thing in the Huss spaghetti pot that is consistent, I think. The class specs, you know, they have an extended Zodiac now. There is one thing I did want to change about class specs, and I want to, you know, this is sort of open-ended. And we can change other characters' class specs, but I think it would be good to switch Dave and June's class specs, and I'll explain why. Because John is the one who does the retcons, and that's very much a timeline-centric thing.
Oh, you mean making John/June a time player? Okay.
Yes, and then
yeah,
Dave has this whole thing with breath where he isn't the main character of Homestuck, but he has like main character syndrome and a hero complex. So I think that would be very good for him. What do you guys think?
I don't know. I don't know that I would necessarily agree with that. Like, I think that one of the things that makes the retcons stand out as unusual is that it isn't a time travel thing. It is a rewriting of the narrative structure itself. And like, I think that needs to be cleared up a little when we get to the retcon. Like, again, I think that it's an effective tool, but I think the idea that like this character who's associated with the narrative isn't traveling through time. They are jumping through the narrative itself and rewriting it. Whereas Dave's got a lot of time travel-y bullshit with the dead Daves and everything. Like, I think it's an interesting idea, but like I think it gets so far into like you would be changing like a quarter of Homestuck at that point, where you'd be associating John with all the time travel bullshit and like Dave with more like the narrative hero's journey type stuff. And I think that like like I get the idea, but I don't personally think I would go in that direction.
So to keep it simple, we'll just keep them the same.
Remember that Dave has all of that theming because it's not good for him. Like, Dave, it is not good for Dave to try to be the main character, and he's, like, self-flagellating on the altar of heroism when, in order to improve as a person, he needs to stop doing what his bro set out for him.
That's huge.
And, like, he does have, like, issues with not having a lot of freedom, so potentially a destructive breath class maybe, but, like, we get so much of the inherent theming of what these aspects mean from the original iteration of these characters that I feel like it would be odd to like you'd basically be saying that most of the symbolism associated with those aspects is now associated with a different one.
Right. Now I play it more fast and loose with the old class specting. But to keep it simple, we can eliminate that. I think it would be fun to think about in like a different rewrite thing, but for the sake of Homestuck, maybe we should just keep the class specs the same. I do think there should be more intentionality with the class specs, like introducing them earlier.
Yeah, I think that
stuff like that.
They're explicitly named pretty early on in Nana's book, but you don't get to know what that means for a long time.
Yeah, and some of them don't get a lot of definition. Like you don't learn as much about some of the other class specs, especially like the troll ones and what they mean. But like, I think introduction, like I think that kind of ties back into like how the game mechanics are handled, where you are a little bit clearer about like what some of the stuff means. Like it doesn't, and not doing it through exposition dumps. That's another issue when we get to the specific. Like,
God, yes. Oh my God, I love the exposition dump. I understand. I totally 100% get, because it's this like, I just thought of all this world building shit, because I make fucking world building documents for some of my stuff, and there is such a huge like temptation to just write a fucking Silmarillion of this is how the trolls work and this is how romance works. But introducing that in a more narrative way, I think would be a good idea.
I think this maybe is something that we should bring up here, because it's not something that really like fits into any of the specific acts, but it's just kind of an overall thing. I would cut down each individual scene's like dialogue and exposition significantly, but make more of them, if that makes sense. Like have it, you can cover more ground in the same time or the same like word count, because there's parts where like Dave just starts rambling about nonsense for like forever, and it's like, okay, that's funny a little bit, but like eventually it's like you just kind of got on a roll and then didn't edit any of this, and it's like same for like exposition dumping and world building, and like you can do all of that in a way that feels more natural if you kind of like lean into what the work is, as far as like having, it's very heavily dialogue based, but like one of the things about heavily dialogue based is that dialogue that rambles on and on and on isn't really that fun to read. Like I have ADHD.
No, I agree.
So reading some of Homestuck was painful to me. Yes. Like I got to the
especially
point
with
where,
the quirks.
The quirks were annoying, but like for me it was more. I would get to a block of red or orange text, and my brain would just
that's
be
the
like,
Act 6 problem.
Implode on itself. Like, oh my God, you've got to be kidding me.
I totally like Act 6 a lot. I love Act 6.
I do too.
Act 6 is probably my favorite act. However, the people who criticize Act 6 for being too fucking long and just packed with just all of this incredibly dense just talking about nothing, I think could be cut down. And I think the biggest thing is this is a work that I would consider maximalist in terms of like and I found my mom said that as a joke when I had her read Homestuck, but I think that it applies. It's maximalist in that it's way longer than it needs to be, because it adds all these external things. And I think a certain amount of that adds to the charm of Homestuck, but a lot of it makes it fucking annoying. For instance, just there's too much.
Committing to the bit of Act 6 or whatever, and seeing that through to the end was a bad decision.
Yeah, I agree. It's like there's so much more that could be balanced out in terms of like in terms of introducing world building and characterization. And like I think we will get into this more when we start talking about stuff like the intermission, where like you've got the opportunity to do some stuff with dialogue, character, world building, and exposition in a more balanced way that doesn't feel like you're just talking for forever. Like cutting away to like other conversations, or like, okay, we're going to talk like, okay, Dave's going to talk for a little bit with like John or whoever, and then we're going to cut to, Rose talking to somebody. So you don't ever get to the point where it feels like you're just like sitting there and you've got a wall of text from one character, especially with characters like Rose and Dave who just love to fucking talk.
Actually, something, not to bring up Act 8 again, but that segment where you gradually, the entire context of the situation was revealed as you got like one or two more sides of a conversation and the context of how these people were having these conversations, that was very well executed, and like a scene like that where you've already established a bunch of different locations and that you have like synchronous communication over Wi-Fi, meaning that like you can, or like over some sort of wireless signal, meaning you can have conversations with people who aren't there, and then you like the first time you see one side of a conversation, you aren't seeing the character who's replying, and then you switch to the character who's replying, and a bunch of their what they're saying is now takes on a completely different context because of the emotions that they're going through at the time. And, like, yes, to some extent, rereading some of the same stuff, you're like, all right, I got this, I've already read some of this. But it's still pulled off, like, that. Despite the fact that Homestuck never did that, it felt very Homestuck because it executed the idea that Homestuck wanted to do.
Act Omega does a similar thing, but it does it in a slightly different way, where you have, like, parallel conversations that kind of, like, play into each other, not directly, but, like, thematically. So, like, you'll have, like, you'll have, like, Dirk and somebody talking, and then, like, Roxy and Calliope talking, and then you'll kind of, like, it's designed to be read, like, left, right, where you're going back and forth between these two conversations, but, like, you're getting the thread of both of them, but also they're kind of, like, related to each other thematically, and, like, I think that those are different approaches to a similar problem, but they both solve the issue of like not having you just staring at this one conversation for a really, really long time. You're getting more variance in the dialogue, and the trick with that is you can have that same long conversation that conveys the same information, but you do it in a way that feels less arduous to read, or alternatively, you can tighten those conversations up a lot, and you can actually do more. Like, you can have more conversations that talk about different things, which would, I think, solve another issue, which is the lack of establishment on some of the world building and some of the characters in a way that ends up feeling very unsatisfying. Again, we'll get into that when we talk about the Dancestors.
Oh, no. I think that in that same vein, what would help the characterization of some of these people is having more group chats. And I say this because it would help the structural things you guys are talking about, and it would also help them, especially the beta kids who feel a little disparate in how they talk to each other. It would help them sort of have a more cohesive group dynamic, because a lot of the conversations are one-on-one. And if you I'm not saying eliminate those, obviously. Have some one-on-one conversations and then have some in group chats, so that you don't have to have this round robin of like people establishing things that you've already seen over and over. This happens a lot in Acts 4 and 5, and I think there should be more of it earlier.
It is genuinely weird that the beta kids don't have a group chat.
Like, yeah, I don't know why.
Just that was you already could have group chats in like Skype or whatever ages ago.
Oh yeah, no. I'll say this now, and I don't know if you want to stick it in anywhere or cut it, but like a lot of the rubric for how the interactions are written down and like the style of Pester Chum and all of that is not based in the technology of 2009. It's based in the technology of like 1999, because like again, I'm about for functional chats. For functional purposes, I'm about Hussey's age. I'm a few years younger, but like we grew up in around the same time, and like all of that stuff feels very familiar to when I was like a teenager in high school and was on like AIM and ICQ and stuff. And it's like,
do you remember IRC chats?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah,
was
it's
about
the
to
same. It's the
say,
same thing.
IRC chats, and
stuff,
it's like
yeah.
you got this one-on-one like AIM conversation style of interaction, and it's like 2009. Yeah, you had better options at that point, and like it feels like a case of like the creator being somewhat anachronistic because like probably they were drawing back to like what they remembered from being a teenager, which would have been at that point fairly out of date. So like, I think that you could do things like either. So two things. One is group chats, and the other is like visually making the chats more engaging to read. Like the way that they're structured is very hard to read if you have ADHD. I'll say that much.
Yeah. Also, yeah. I think that's all great. This will all of these changes and sort of similarities that we've outlined right now are kind of in a vacuum. They will be more fleshed out in when we talk about the actual events of the comic. So to end out the sort of differences, and you hit on this briefly, the act structure I think can be totally fucking discarded because it sucks.
Oh yeah.
Not, and a lot of people, well, that's what makes, that's part of the charm of Homestuck to some people, and that's fine. But we're not. The purpose of this is not to make Homestuck like preserve the charm. It's to sort of rewrite it in a more intentional way. And I think that to that end, you can still have some of that confusing timeline bullshit. But broadly speaking, whether this is formal or not, I think that instead of these bullshit acts or acts or act acts or whatever, you just broadly have 4 segments, quadrants, if you will. So here's what I had. Is my idea, and if this sounds good or bad, you guys can tell me. So instead of acts, you have 2 parts, which are both split into 2 acts respectively. So you have part 1, which is acts 1 through 5, and then part 2, which is act 6, and these are both split into 2. So act 1, part 1 is getting into the game, and then act 1, part 2 is the lead up to Cascade and the trolls and all that stuff. And then you go into part 2, which is the reboot. Part 1 would be everything before the retcon, like leading up to game over. And then the rest of that would be leading up to the final battle. And so instead, and these would not be equal sizes perhaps, but they would be equal in narrative importance. I think that would eliminate a lot of the, again, maximalist confusion that occurs in Homestuck.
I think that I like that, and I think that like so whatever part 1, act 1 would be like if you go up through the intermission, and then because like the intermission is this kind of like it matters, but like its full significance isn't revealed until later. But you kind of like bookended on the intermission, which is this very kind of like what the fuck was that about, and then you go into the trolls and then leading into Cascades. You have like all the Alternian world building and stuff, and you have this like parallel to the kids, and you have this kind of like reset of the story, and it's like that's gonna throw people off at first, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. And then like part 2, act 1 would be sort of like, I think balancing the lead into the retcon and then the post retcon better would be good, because like in the actual comic, post retcon is real fast. Like the retcon happens and then it's like bam, everything is just over. And I think having it be more evenly balanced, where you have more of the consequences of the retcon, both in terms of like plot and also the, I guess it would, at that point it would be June's decision and how that affects her, because like I think there's some stuff that when we get to the retcon and game over, there's some things I think that weren't talked about in Homestuck that really should have been, as far as like June's relation to the narrative and the people that were involved. But I'll save that for later.
What do you think of that, Bucky?
I mean, I think the benefit of like, I was an update reader for the retcon, and it felt like a huge slap in the face.
Yes. Yeah, that was when I was getting into it, like actually reading it, so I understand.
I got caught up in early 2012. So like the rereading it coming down after the retcon feels like Bing Bang Boom. There was so long of a wait between some of those things that the thing about Homestuck is that there were so many pauses on so many cliffhangers that we filled in the gaps of what was coming over and over and over again.
That's interesting.
And I was going to mention this about the recaps in the comic too, because the recaps were written for the benefit of people who had read the previous act or two over the course of a year or so and needed a recap to remember what the fuck had happened because they read it in tiny bite-sized pieces. They're grating when you're an archival reader because you're like, I just read this and it's so long.
And then they don't have recaps on what is actually confusing.
Right, yeah, because they gave up by that point. Like, being able to plan it beforehand, I think there's a way to work in the retcon that isn't just slapping Vriska as a band-aid over the problem.
Lol. Oh, yeah. We'll talk about the retcons when we get there, but I totally fucking agree. I like the idea of a huge retcon that fixes something that went terribly, horribly wrong. However, how it was handled in Homestuck has some good parts and some terrible parts.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Like, it is a very fascinating concept, especially how Homestuck portrays it as the, not a time travel thing. Like, I think that actually has, like, really, really cool implications and also some really horrifying implications that, like, I think are narratively interesting to explore, but, like, Homestuck just kind of didn't. It just, like, yeah, that happened, I guess. And it's like, that was cool, right? And, like, yeah, it's something that I think balancing this story and having intentionality all the way through would help with a lot.
Yeah, I think that's going to be the main theme of this, is a lot of things exist in Homestuck without intentionality, and we're going to add some of that and then change other things that suck ass. So we're coming up on an hour and a half in recording. I don't know how long this is going to be in the final version. However, I think we have a pretty good idea of sort of the premise that we're working on, and I had some notes here that I'll just read and recap, and then we can sort of finish up our thoughts. So I have, the first thing I have is make June an egg, which is, I think we were unanimous on. Absolutely. That's a good idea. Dave By, I of course wrote Rose Lesbionics, and then make them 18. Everyone, including the trolls, is going into either college or the military. And with the alpha kids, we can have Dirk and Roxy sort of subvert that by saying, like, no, we know we're going into suburb. Stuff like that. We can get into that when we get into that. But broadly, going into college/military, depending on if you're a troll or human.
I mean, there's part of the bittersweet stuff of mostly bitter, of the alphas, is that, like, Dirk and Roxy know that they aren't. Literally, the only way that they get to meet their friends is by playing this game. Yep. Otherwise, they are stuck in the future.
Yes, that's huge. I think we should keep that. I do
still like that detail.
Yep.
Yeah, I think a lot of the existential stuff of the alphas is really interesting, and just, like, it needs to be tightened up and handled in a way that feels more purposeful.
Yeah, like, yes, every event when you are 16 feels like the worst thing ever because it's the first time you've experienced it with this level of consciousness, but, like, having them be a couple of years older and maybe a smidgen more experience would make it feel less grating.
Right. Maybe Dave even has a job or something. So the next one is more grounded in geography, and they have more to do broadly with the world around them before they go into suburb, like, including other characters that die in group chats. And then I had no raciality. Again, we're just gonna we're gonna kind of cop that one out because we're all fucking whiteys.
I don't think it's a cop out to say that we aren't the people who should be talking about it. I think it's acknowledging that.
The cop out is, we're not going to speak to what races they should or should not be, because, why would we? Then there's, I wrote down Guardians. I'm assuming that is in reference to having the Guardians play a more specific and intentional role, like, in their lives, sort of in the same vein of have them more grounded in the earth as a setting that dies.
Yeah.
I just wrote down intentionality last on this section. And then the things that we can keep the same but improve on are alchemy / capsulogs and the comp sci aspect, like Bucky said. I think that's a great idea. And I'm glad that you mentioned that, because that is something that people really, really loved about the early acts that didn't get enough love in the later ones that people criticize. More intentionally with the world building and less info dumps about that stuff. We'll keep the structure of how timelines work, like Doom timelines, the Alpha timeline, etc., etc. I think that's totally fine. Class specs will keep the same, because I think, A, they're fine, and B, if we changed anything like we got into with the June Dave thing, it would just change way too much.
Yeah.
And it would be a different story.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the basic structure in the 4 parts that we outlined at the end.
Yeah.
Is there anything I missed?
So there's one thing which I just saw going back over my notes, and this is like,
Yep.
I think we've all been kind of presuming, but I think it's worth mentioning specifically, and that is getting rid of the shitty dated language, by which I mean the slurs.
Oh.
Like, I think
Yeah.
that they were added in a very,
slurs.
I think they were added in a very,
They're peak unintentional.
they are peak unintentional. Like, that's how Andrew Hussey talked. Like, you can say whatever you want about, oh, that's how kids on the internet talked. Like, no, that's how Andrew Hussey talked. Like, I've read his blogs. I've read all of the stuff where he says those words just, like, very casually. It's like, that's how he talked. That was the thing on, like, the Something Awful forums, was to kind of talk like that. Like, that's...
I love the thing where they say, oh, everyone talked like that back in 2009. I fucking didn't.
Right.
My parents would have kicked me.
It is grating. It doesn't add anything. And, like, I think that it cheapens the entire work and makes it age very, very poorly in those instances. And, like, honestly, given the word count of Homestuck, the slurs aren't even that big a part of it. So, like, just removing that kind of language entirely is, like, you can still have them you can still have your shitty people be shitty people without them saying the fucking R slur. So,
yeah.
You know what it is? You know what it is that bothers me about it?
What?
It's just so reminiscent of the time on the internet when 4chan was presumed to be the premier place that created the rules of the internet that dictated how you existed on the internet. The number one of which was that there are no girls on the internet. And then a bunch of, like, further gross sexual things. That was just, like, normal. That was how people presumed to act on the internet.
That's where Rule 34 comes from. That rules that you say when you say they were presumed to make the rules of the internet. That's not just like that's literally explicit. Like, they made the rules of the internet. They wrote them down. That's what Rule 34 comes from.
That's where nobody uses Rule 63 to mean gender bent anymore.
Right.
But there was a significant period of time where, like, gender bent stuff was tagged as Rule 63 because that was how you find it and distinguish it.
I agree. I don't want to be a Puritan and say that you can never say slurs, because I think that's obviously wrong, and that's not what we're trying to say clearly. It's that the slurs were used in a way, and I have a video about this. I don't mean to plug my video, but slurs in Homestuck are not used for any purpose. They're just there because they were written without thinking. It's not like the Mark Twain excuse where, like, oh, I'm trying to preserve the time that they were written, or make an example of, like, you know, a time period. No, that's not true. That's total hogwash. No one, I don't know. Having grown up in 2009, like Bucky, I am in that sort of broad age group. People didn't talk like that in 2009. Like, the slurs weren't, they didn't, the R slur did not become a slur post. Or, like, post, 2010. Like, this is not cancel culture, this is not anything. We knew those words were not good to say. We said them because we were dumb kids, and that is why they are in Homestuck. And I don't think that, like you said, it preserves anything, because, you know.
Yeah, your language choice matters, and, like, if you're going to choose intentionally inflammatory or particularly, like, controversial language, there should be a reason that you're doing that. And there's having read about every slur in Homestuck again and again and again in the process of rewriting them
fun?
out of it, not for fun, but because I did the slur replacement project that takes the fucking slurs out. Like, I wanted to understand, like, the context of why they were being used, and then, like, write around them in a way that didn't feel like, oh, a word is missing, or it's, like, bleeped out. And, like, it never felt like something that's like, oh, yeah, this has meaning in the narrative, and I can't change it.
Yeah,
it was always this is just a word that Andrew Hussey liked.
Yeah.
It's just, I have, like, very distinct memories of going to school in, like, 2009, 2010, 2011, and there were posters up around my school that said stuff like, why would you use the word blah-de-blah when you could use word cloud with words that mean what that intended, but not the slur?
Call him a
Which
dummy.
is like, all right, this is a hell of a concept.
Yeah.
And this is like, it said like slurs hurt people or something at the bottom. And like, it did it with gay, it did it with the R slur, it did it with a couple of other words. Which, like, again, wildly misguided, but it was indicative of the fact that, like, if schools were willing to put up, like, clearly, like, mass-produced posters about, well, like, how you shouldn't be using these words around the time when Homestuck was coming out, I'm pretty sure that we were aware that that was fucked up to say. Yeah. And not everybody was on fucking 4chan in 2009. That wasn't how everybody in the internet was. That was how 4chan was.
Sadly.
4chan is not everybody.
It's horrible.
Despite what certain people who have prominence in the Homestuck fandom would say. Like the author.
I again, I think this is something that also kind of calls back to, like, this is something that somebody who's old enough to have been a teenager in the 90s thinks, because, like, the R slur in particular was far more normalized in the 90s, and then, like, awareness of that being a really, really shitty thing to say grew, and, like, yeah, by the time you're hitting, like, those mid-aughts and late aughts even. Yeah, you, like, the understanding is that that's a bad thing to say, but, like, back in the fucking, mid to late 90s, it was pretty normalized. Like, okay, fuck, I've got enough commonality with Andrew Hussey that I can speak on this. I also grew up in Massachusetts. There's a few slurs that Massachusetts really, really likes. One of them is the R slur, or liked, I should say, in the 90s. One of them was the R slur. One of them was using queer as a slur, and one of them was the F slur for gay folks. Those are kind of like the big three as far as, like, words that I remember being relatively normalized as a child, like, in order of how commonly heard, probably queer, R slur, F slur, but, like, they were all there, and yeah, I can see why Andrew Hussey maybe thought that, but, like, he held on to it way longer than they needed to.
I agree.
I even, like, growing up in Connecticut, I have memories of my dad at least saying the R slur. That was something that he didn't say a lot. He said swear words very rarely, but that was one of the words that he considered okay enough to say around his kids.
My parents are totally different. If I said, like, even if I said queer at all, they would have been like, no. And they weren't people who cared about the fuck word either. But they were sensitive to that, so I have a different experience. However, as, for all the haters, make your own Homestuck rewrite if you don't like it. As we all know, we the three of us are SJWs who wants to destroy fun in all of its forms.
That's an accurate and not hyperbolic statement.
And that's why we're doing this, because we want to remove the fun from Homestuck. We want to make it boring and horrible, and that's why we're doing this. So make your comments, do whatever you want.
That's the reason that we just spent over an hour talking about, like, how we're going to preserve the essential narrative structure and, like, general tone of it while making it better.
Yes. But yeah, we hate fun, and we want everyone to stop having it, because fun is amoral. And with that, I think that is sort of I think that's it.
Yeah.
Unless you guys have anything super specific that you wanted to mention, that is sort of the premise-based stuff that we have gone through. just sort of the structure moving forward. I'm going to keep these notes on file, and it will inform us in the next parts, which are going to be talking about the specific story of Homestuck, sort of point by point, event by event. That will inform what happens in Homestuck. So this has been sort of the overview of the rewrites. Is there anything you guys want to close out on to end this? Because I do not have anything. I said all the stuff I wanted to.
I kind of already said this before, but just like intentionality in a story.
Huge.
I know that Hussey like had this outlined or whatever, and that they had a general goal. But I think like our specific goal of like knowing how we reacted to the overall story and trying to organize what we've been presented in such a way that doesn't alter it too fundamentally, but makes it less of a I think. Actually, yes. I would like to sort of like set aside reader hostility as an idea of something that is integral to Homestuck, and I would like to propose just reader interactivity. The most fun parts, like when I was first introduced to the idea of reader hostility, what I thought of was when you're trying to get through Caliborn's like temper tantrum, and you can't click the next button because it is literally bouncing around the screen, and it was kind of annoying, especially if you were on like a shitty little netbook like I was trying to like desperately get the page to load because everyone was trying to view it. But like, it was funny, even if it was a little frustrating.
Yeah, or the time where Caliborn stops everything, you can't click the next page. It's just him playing that stupid fucking symphony.
Yeah.
Yes. Like that. There's a time and a place for it, like with a meta-narrative character such as Caliborn, but also just that idea of interactivity where, like, the Homestuck has always been an interplay between the fans and its creator, and trying to stick more with the, like, enjoyment of people who are interacting with it and less resentment of your own audience, I think is a good thing to keep in mind, because I
agree.
That was really what killed it in the end, was being resentful of the people who wanted more.
I think that's a really good...
No reader has
Excuse me. I think that's a really good point, and, like, I've made the comment before that, like, as soon as you start seeing, as an author of a work, as soon as you start seeing your audience as not your, collaborators in this work that you're creating, but as your enemies, you've kind of already failed as an author. And, like, I think that Homestuck got to the point where it was like, stuff like the Caliborn stuff, I've used the term reader antagonistic before to differentiate from, like, a hostile text where it may be unpleasant to read, or it may have elements that make it, like, deliberately unfriendly for the purposes of narrative, like the Caliborn stuff. And I think that is stuff you need to think about and balance, but, like, you should never be reader antagonistic. Like, the overall experience should be one that the reader wants to continue engaging with in a genuine way, not just because they have a time sink involved. And, like, if your work is relying on the sunk cost fallacy to keep your audience, maybe you're not doing it right at that point. And it's so huge. And I think that's something that continued to echo throughout the work and into the post-canon work. And, like, I think it's tragic because this was such an opportunity to create a work that has this interplay between the fandom and the work itself in a really meaningful and powerful way. And it's like, there's such a tone of what feels to me like resentment that comes out throughout the work. And that's sucks. Like, it sucks because
especially in the post-canon stuff.
Yeah, especially in post-canon stuff. It's like, it's not a fun experience, and I would rather have it continue to be, a work that wants to engage with its audience. Like, I don't agree that, and I'm not saying this is something either of you said, but something I've heard in the Homestuck fandom. I don't agree that, like, the readers don't want a challenging text, or they don't want, like, an unpleasant experience. Like, they don't want to read unpleasant things. Like, I don't think that's true.
Oh, God. If they didn't want to read an unpleasant experience, they wouldn't have fucking read Homestuck.
Right, like, you can...
If I didn't want to read an unpleasant experience, how would I have been able to pull off voicing Kankri and Matuna at the same time doing their conversation live on stream?
Like, there is you can create an experience where you have unpleasant things happening and you deal with unpleasant subjects and you deal with harsh, themes and whatnot, and you still are on your audience's side. You're still there to engage with them. You can even have the narrator character become like hostile. Like that's a big part of Homestuck, is the narrator kind of like becomes this almost hostile entity. But the problem is, it felt like in the end, it was just the actual author feeling that way and not the narrator character anymore. And like, I feel like that's a distinction that needs to be drawn. And you, as the author or as the team writing it, should always be on your audience's side. And I think that that's something that's very important to keep as you're going forward, especially with a work of this magnitude.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's it. That's all I got. I'm excited to get into the actual story parts, and I think the audience will be as well. But yeah, do you guys want to? So continue, please, by all means.
You're posting this on YouTube, right? Like with waveforms and such?
Correct. I am going to be putting this on YouTube as well as Bandcamp. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge to the viewers. Eventually. For now, while we make this, I'm going to be posting it to YouTube periodically.
May I suggest that the next time we record one of these, we get like a whiteboard thing that we can all draw on, so that one, we have some visuals, but two, there's like sort of a guiding situation, because we're gonna have, with this general overview, I think was totally fine, but we are gonna have like a lot of stuff to cover, and I think having a visual representation of what the heck is going on would help everybody, since all of us have ADHD.
Lol. That'd be fine. I have no clue how to set that up. However, we'll figure it out.
We'll get like
so next time, look forward to some actual visuals instead of just, a dancing little line that you're seeing right now, probably. I mean, obviously the SoundCloud will not have any sort of visual. You'll have to watch it in a dark sensory deprivation chamber to get the full effect. But yeah, whiteboard would be a great idea. That's big brain. Plug your guys' stuff, because this will be on my channel. So you guys, my plug already exists passively. So you guys plug your stuff.
Well, we both work on New Game Plus and Friendsim 2, which are both by Studio June, which is our little games collective. You can follow Studio June's Twitter @_Studio June. New Game Plus is @HS New Game Plus on Tumblr and Twitter, and then Friendsim 2 is, I think, @Friendsim 2 on Tumblr and Twitter. But we're directing and writing in some degree both of those, and I would definitely check those games out. We have trailers on the Studio June YouTube channel for both now. So if you want to get an idea of what kind of games we're making with ideas like these, check those out for sure.
So I should have said this up top, but we're not nobodies in the fandom.
Yeah, no, I feel like we can all kind of claim that we have at least a little bit of influence in the fandom generally. Like, I've kind of been dancing around that, but yeah, we all have been here long enough to have made something of an impact.
And me being the person who killed God has influence over all of reality. So by proxy, I have control over the Homestuck fandom.
The transitive property of reality control or something. I don't know.
Yes.
But yeah, check those out. And then I guess personally, we're both on Twitter. I'm @AltUniverseWash on Twitter. I post the random thoughts about stuff, sometimes Homestuck, sometimes not. When I'm not working on a game, I will post regular writing, but I'm working on a game right now, so all of my writing gets done behind closed doors, and you don't get to see it until the game comes out. But if you bear with me, I will eventually start posting writing again, if that's something you're into.
Tight. I'm into writing because we're doing a rewrite project. Again, I don't have any plugs because you're already on my channel. And cool.
Yeah.
Bye. and then I dab.
Bye.
Bye.
Nice.
Rewriting Homestuck is a podcast by Jojo McLovin, Janiah Riley, and Bucky Grant, hosted and produced by me, Jojo. Please follow the links in the description to each collaborator's Twitter and subscribe on YouTube. I'd like to thank my patrons for this month: Pyrate, Zipperozic, Kaleidoscope Mediator, Luna Skywalker Tucker, and Jojro. My Patreon can be found at patreon.com/funkmclovin. Have a great day.